Hi everyone, this is Grace and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are going to learn how to decorate 12 cookies from a Halloween mini set, so let's go. First up is the simple candy corn. For this entire set, I'm doing a 1 consistency outline and flood, and that's because these are mini cookies. Just can't be bothered with outlining such small little cookies. So I'm using 1 consistency, and this is a very thick 1 consistency. It is as thick as I can tolerate, and in some cases later when I'm doing a wet on wet, it's even a little too thick, but I just work with it. When I say a thick flood, it just barely falls off the spoon in a stream. If you take your bowl of icing, pick up a spoonful and raise it and drop it down, it will just barely come off that spoon and fall off evenly. It's important to use a very thick flood when doing minis to try to prevent craters in icing. Craters happen naturally in royal icing, and it actually always happens, but on a larger surface, it's not as visible. But the smaller the area that you're flooding, the more prominent looking the craters are going to be. This is natural. It's the meringue powder that's just sinking in the icing, the weight of it. So if you're using a thicker icing, there's just more stability so that the craters are less likely to happen. For this, I am doing a flooding in sections, which means that I let the white and the yellow crust over so that then when I go in and do this orange, it will dry with definition in between the sections. If I hadn't waited for the white and the yellow to dry, then it would have just sunk into each other and it would have appeared to be more like a wet on wet flat look. But this is a simple cookie and I wanted to make sure there was some sort of detailed dimension, so that's why I'm doing a flooding in sections. And because my flood is so thick, I need to use a scribe always to help it settle. I personally only use a scribe when I absolutely have to, and this is definitely an instance where I have to. So super simple candy corn cookie. I'm a fan. There you go. Next, we are on to the ghost. For this one, I am again outlining with a single consistency. It's important when you're outlining, as you can see, that I'm raising my bag ever so slightly to get those nice clean lines, either straight or rounded. And I immediately go in and I start to flood the cookie. This is the same bag, same consistency. It's just a difference in pressure on the bag to get significantly more icing out than the first time. Here we go, and then I'm going to come in with my scribe, give it a little jiggle. This was particularly thick. I let that crust over nicely, and now I'm moving on to the candy corn. I could have done these as transfers as well, but I just didn't feel like it. I wanted to pipe them directly onto the cookie. Doing transfers does take some forethought so that they can dry before you put them on the cookie. For this, I am using the piping consistency that I have for this set, which is a bit more like a soft peak, so that you can see after I pipe these, pipe the different colors of the candy corn, I fix my little mistake there, then I take a scribe and it can actually jiggle and settle with some help from the scribe. If I had used my flood consistency for this, although it is very thick, it would have been too thin and it would have been misshapen for the candy corn. This is that same piping consistency that I used for the white on the candy corn to pipe these eyes. I want to use as thick as I can so that again it doesn't crater. Here I am again, this is piping consistency. I'm doing piping on top of piping, a soft peak, that's important. A medium peak would not sink into each other like you can see with the eyes. And this is an edible marker by AmeriColor. The last touches, my candy corn could have dried a little bit more before I did this, but this is fine. And this is pressure piping with that same soft peak piping consistency just to get these cute little arms overlapping the candy corn. And that, my friends, is the ghost. Up next, we have the bat. First step here is I'm doing the inset of the ears. This is a super simple technique where I'm just piping a little bit of piping consistency and then using a brush to just smooth it out. I do let this dry before moving on to the next step. If I hadn't let it dry, it most likely would have bled into my next color here, which is the black. This is the flood consistency, one consistency, outline and flood. This beautiful black icing, I'm using the Sugar Art Master Elite Black. This is a powder, it's highly pigmented. I recommend this over any other black gel food coloring. Here I am piping the ears. This is actually piping consistency here so that I can get the definition of the cutout. You will not get the definition for cutouts that you need if you use flood consistency, even a very thick flood. So I'm going in here. This is now flood consistency to do the ears. The way I pipe even little sections like this, again, I really don't like to use a scribe unless I have to, so I am doing all the work that I need to most of the time just with the tip of the bag like there. I've let that dry before I move on to the wings. This is again more flooding in sections so I can get the definition between the different sections of the bat. You can see again that I'm using the tip of my bag to do any like jiggling and finessing that I need. Moving on here. When I was piping these sections, not filming, I would move the cookie around to a better angle to flood, but for the sake of the video, I left the cookie as is. You know me though, always move the cookie to the most convenient angle for you for decorating. Now I'm going to let that dry. Again, it has a nice crust and I'm going to the details. This is piping consistency, roughly medium soft peak. Just piping these final little details, lifting my bag for these lines, maybe 1/4 of an inch off the cookie. Again, I am doing the eyes with piping consistency. Coming in again for little whites on the eyes. And this is again the AmeriColor edible marker. And here we are, these adorable little fangs. I'm piping dots first with piping consistency and then using a scribe to pull that out to get the fang effect. I let those fangs dry and now I'm coming in with just a little bit of red food gel coloring to make it look like blood. And there's the bat. Up next, we have the bone. Again, this is a single consistency, outline and flood. This white icing was definitely on the thickest end that I would ever want to use for a flood, but I made it work. A little scribe action to help it settle. You can see it still settles pretty quickly with just a little bit of help. I let that dry, and now I'm using piping consistency to pipe out the little drips. It's thin enough that it does kind of settle and have a nice rounded look to it. Here I am painting the blood, and this is just pure red food gel coloring. I realized after I really did use too much gel food coloring here, so I would use a little bit less. Food gel coloring dries still kind of sticky. So you'll see after I paint this, I have a little trick for helping it to be unsticky, to not be sticky in those bags. And I say I know that I used too much food gel coloring because in this next step, what I'm going to show you in a moment, I will show you that I am using cornstarch. I'm just dusting that over. Even with the cornstarch, this blood still stuck to the cellophane bags after I bagged the cookies, so I know that I used too much gel. But it was cute. It was worth it. The next cookie is the trick or treat bag. I'm going to be doing wet on wet polka dots next, so I want to make sure that this surface has flattened out enough, but I need to work very quickly so I don't spend quite as much time flattening out that yellow. And here I go piping these wet on wet dots, moving very quickly. The thicker the flood that you're working with, the faster you have to work when doing wet on wet. And you can see as I'm piping these that the dots are not quite settling, so a trick here is to take a scribe and jiggle just the very surface of the icing. This is helping the purple dots settle into the yellow before it all starts to really crust over. I let this dry in the dehydrator for about 15 minutes. Without a dehydrator, I'd say maybe closer to 30 minutes. You want to make sure that it has a crust when you go to do this crackle effect, because I really want it to crack, not just indent. Here I am using a fondant tool, but you can also just use the end of a paintbrush. And you can see that I am poking a little too far in because I am starting to get icing on the ball, and that's not the goal here. I let that dry completely, and then I go in and I'm just using piping consistency and then dipping this straight into my sprinkles for the little bit of candy. And I use a scribe here to kind of adjust the placement of the sprinkles before the icing actually dries. And then I'm using piping consistency to pipe the handle. There you go, trick or treat bag. Up next is the candy to go in the trick or treat bag. So I am doing a little wet on wet action here, outlining and flooding the center first. This is actually a spider cookie cutter, but I thought it lended nicely to a piece of candy. So again, preparing for my wet on wet, so it's really thick flood, so I want to give it a little bit of a chance to settle before I do that wet on wet. And now I'm going to go in with my flood consistency, work quickly but precisely, and this is a circle, so I'm lifting that bag quite far off the surface of the icing to get the nicest round circles that I can. I let that dry, and now I am going in and I'm piping the edges of the wrapper on the candy, and I'll show you in a second. I'm using an angled cut here on my bag, and you want to use that tip. That tip goes down, touching the cookie. Just a really easy way to finish this cookie. And there you have it. Up next is the cat. I'm doing the same technique with the ears that I did with the bat. So using piping consistency and then painting it with a paintbrush, and again letting that dry before moving on to the next step so that the colors don't bleed into each other. Again, using piping consistency here to outline the cutout so that the shape stays defined. And right away, I go to outline in flood for the most seamless look with those cutouts. I allow this to dry, significant crust, before I move on to this next step to do this bare texture. So I prefer to just pipe the piping consistency directly on the cookie. And then I'm using a brush here that has a pretty wide, rounded end to it. So I'm more or less using this brush perpendicular to the cookie, so it's just an up-down tapping motion. The more icing that you use, the bigger the peaks are going to be on this technique. If you just want a tiny bit of texture and not really change the surface all that much, then you want to use less icing. For this, I was going more on the less texture side because I'm going to be piping on top of it, as you see here. Again, allow that texture to dry before you move on to the next step so that colors don't bleed. I'm doing the same eyes here that I've done on the other cookies with piping consistency. I will use a scribe here just to help that eye settle a little bit. Piping consistency again, this is a pressure piped little heart for the nose. Piping on the finishing details. I did try to do this with the edible marker, but found that it just wasn't popping quite enough because of the black on black. So I decided to pipe the details instead of using a marker. And there you have it. That's the cute little cat. Up next is the witch's hat. I love this purple. So many people have asked me, how did I get this purple? I have no idea. I almost always hand mix my colors. Also, a trick to getting your colors to match well in a set is to always mix a tiny bit of each color into each other. So if you're doing a small amount of icing, I'd say maybe just a pea size, but if it's a large batch and you're doing a lot of icing, maybe more like a quarter. And this just helps the colors to more match each other, I believe the same tone. I'm doing a wet on wet here, and I'm going to move pretty quickly to get that to settle a little bit, and then moving in with my white to do this little star sparkle effect. This is a pull with a scribe, and to keep it clean, I am cleaning off my scribe in between each pull. If I didn't do that, then you would see a little bit of purple icing in the center of these little stars, and I didn't want that. So I'm doing the painstaking task of cleaning off my scribe in between each pull. And here we are, last little details, wet on wet. I do let that dry, and now I'm moving on to piping the details. For this was a little tricky because I'm piping the lines right next to each other. So it can be a little hard. I'm moving pretty slowly for me to get these lines exactly next to each other. And there is the witch's hat. Up next is the spider web. I didn't have a specialized spider shape for this, so I just used a circle. You can use a lot of different shapes to do this design. This is a wet on wet design that I will be doing. So outlining and flooding. Again, I regretted just a little bit how thick my white is, but I survived. My biggest tip for this design is to start and end your circles at one of the tips of the spider web, because that's where you're going to pull with the scribe. And even for me, I have a hard time with wet on wet getting my start and end really seamless with a circle. So when I go in here, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull at that point. So you can't even see that start stop in the circle because I'm pulling with the scribe for the design. Again, for this, I am cleaning off my scribe in between each pull because I didn't want there to be any white icing in that center. I will let that dry, and now I'm using my piping consistency, which again is a soft peak here, so it can settle out. I tried to pipe it without moving the cookie, but I just couldn't. I needed that angle to get the little legs in. And then while that's still wet, and again using piping consistency, I'm going to come in and pipe those cute little eyes. And that is the spider web. Up next is the spider itself. Again, this will be a wet on wet design. When piping a larger wet on wet, you want to just pipe on the surface like you can see I'm doing here. I'm not actually putting that much icing into the surface. I'm just piping it on top, if that makes sense. And now I'm using a scribe here to pull it through, but you can see the tip is a little too jagged, so I use a scribe to kind of pull that off to keep my circle rounded. Then I'm using the Sugar Art Diamond Dust here, which is a purely edible glitter, just for a little extra something. Piping my eyes here with piping consistency. And finally, I'm going in with piping consistency again to pipe these cute little legs. And that is the spider. Up next is the pumpkin. This black surface is black gel food coloring painted directly onto the dough before it bakes. It cracks like this because during baking, the dough does expand ever so slightly, and that's what cracks the surface of it. I also could have done the same painting technique that I did with the ears of the cat and the bat, but I decided to do something a little bit different. For this, it is absolutely crucial that you use piping consistency to outline the shape of these cutouts first, because again, it would not be able to hold its shape if you use flood consistency. Whenever I do cutouts, I like to flood around the cutouts first. I like to think that it helps give the most seamless look if you're able to flood while that outline is still a little bit wet. One thing to note on this is that it was not necessary to paint the entire surface of the cookie black. I had intended to do a different design when I made them, but ultimately decided to change it up. So if you're going to do this just for the cutouts, you only need to paint as much surface as you need for the cutouts to show through. I allow that to dry, and then I go in with my final details using piping consistency for the stem. I did a black stem because I didn't use brown for the set, and why not? For the leaf, this is actually piping consistency, so this is where it's really important to have that soft peak, because I'm going to do some pressure piping here and pipe out a significant amount of icing from that little tip. And I wanted this leaf nice and poofy, which is why I'm using that piping consistency and using the tip of the bag to help it all settle. It's a little jiggle motion. And while that's still wet, I do actually go in with the same bag after I clean off the tip and then pipe the last little detail on the leaf. And that is the pumpkin. And last but not least in this set is the boo. This again is going to be a wet on wet technique. So I'm going to try to move as fast as I can to pipe and outline and flood this part. So since my flood is on the thicker side, you can see as I'm doing these pulls that the end of the pull is sticking up a little bit. And for that, I'm going to use my scribe just to help the little end peaks settle. And I had to move really quickly with this design, so I did not clean off my scribe in between each pull, and for that, I was fine. And last but not least on this cookie is to actually pipe the boo. I decided to do a pressure piped boo, which means I'm varying the pressure based on where I am on the letter. But this design, it's totally fine also to just evenly pipe a letter, whatever you're comfortable doing. So there's the boo. And that, my friends, is the entire 12 cookies from this Halloween mini set. I hope you enjoy making them. Boo!